You're listening to Liberty Buzzard with Dustin Hammett and Thomas Umstattd Jr.
Episode 35.
I'm Dustin Hammett.
I'm Thomas Umstattd Jr.
Welcome to the show where we pick at the news, giving you an entertaining perspective on culture and technology. It's a podcast for inquisitive minds. Today, we're going to be discussing nuclear weapons, nuclear preparedness, and certain death by a WMD, which is short for weapon of mass destruction. For you history buffs out there, you might remember WMDs. That's really hard to say. WMDs back from 2003 in our invasion of Iraq. Thomas and I have some interesting perspective on what exactly a WMD. But first, let's talk about nuclear holocaust. There was a article published in nature.com the other day saying that the United States is woefully unprepared, quote unquote, woefully unprepared for a nuclear strike. And I read that article, and my first thought was, yeah, no crap. And then my second thought was, what is truly prepared for a nuclear holocaust? You know, if there's a nuclear holocaust, or even just an isolated nuclear strike, who is going to be the most prepared? And from my military perspective, the most prepared nation is going to be that nation that doesn't count on technology to survive. So my position, my opinion is that whoever survives that initial strike, they're going to have to then figure out how to survive on their own. You know, they're going to have to make their food, shelter, all that kind of stuff. And people in modern day America are woefully unprepared for a nuclear strike, because I doubt that a majority of Americans knows how to farm for themselves, knows how to grow food, really even knows what an edible plant is that isn't found in a grocery store. So I think, beyond the initial strike, I think the most devastating aspect of a nuclear war is not necessarily the initial strike, but the mass starvation, mass hysteria that occurs afterward, as our nation temporarily, or even long-term temporarily, is put back to a 19th, 18th century status where we pretty much have to plow horse and buggy because there's no gasoline, there's no infrastructure, there's nothing to get us by. So I get that perspective from some of the third world countries I've visited. I've been to the Philippines, I've been to to Iraq. And those countries, in my opinion, are actually going to be better prepared for the aftermath of nuclear holocaust than we ever will be. Simply because they still have mules, donkeys, in the Philippines case, oxen, that they farm with. That's their primary farm implementation. And if your animals can survive the initial nuclear attack, not necessarily the explosion, but the radiation, everything after the fact, then you actually still have a tool that you can use to farm, to eat, to grow food, like we did way back in the 19th century and the 18th century. So that's my perspective. What's your take, Thomas?
So I actually read a book a couple of years ago, and I'll link to it in the show notes. So the title of the book is The Knowledge: How to Rebuild Civilization in the Aftermath of a Cataclysm. And I think all of you owe it to yourselves and to your descendants to have a copy of this book and to hide it somewhere, to put it into a safe and put it down in the ground. But it was a really fascinating book because it was all about this question of how do you rebuild civilization? And this is an important conversation to have because civilization has collapsed not once, but twice. There was a cataclysm that brought to an end all of the Bronze Age civilizations within a handful of years. And we don't really know exactly what it was. Their writings mention the Sea Peoples, and something happened, and the Egyptian Empire collapsed, the Hittite Empire collapsed. All of these different empires in the Mediterranean basin collapsed, and they were like back to almost Stone Age technology for like hundreds of years after that, before the next kind of age, the Iron Age, kind of emerged, or whatever the name of the age after that. And then we had the collapse of the Roman Empire. So at least in Europe, civilization collapsed again, and people kind of went back. They didn't go all the way back to Stone Age, so we're making some progress, but it took a long time, in some cases 1,500 years, for architecture to regain the strength in plumbing. And, the Romans had central plumbing and, ways of moving waste out of the city. And, in some places it was 1800s before they brought that technology back. 1700s before they brought that technology back. So this is something that we should talk about. Western civilization has collapsed before. It could collapse again. And how quickly we bounce back from that collapse depends on what the collapse is and how prepared we are for it. And the knowledge kind of walks through the various things that could, cause civilization to crack. The more complicated, the more advanced your civilization is, the more fragile it is. It becomes very self-repairing. So a good example of this is Japan had 2 cataclysms at the same time. They had an earthquake and a tsunami and a nuclear meltdown, actually. So 3. The nuclear meltdown was a result of the earthquake and the tsunami. And they were able to bounce back pretty quickly because civilization worked, and Toyota's factories were all down, but then Toyota factories all got back together. And that was encouraging to see. But at some point, you get to where civilization isn't able to repair itself, and it's so harmed that it can't bounce back. And one of the things that can do that is a nuclear bomb. Another is a plague. That's historically what happened. Rome had a terrible series of plagues that depopulated the city and made it hard to fight off the barbarians, because when half your population has died from plague, and the barbarians who live out in the hinterlands and aren't getting plague as bad because they're not living on top of each other, aren't having their populations die off, it makes it really hard to win those wars to keep Rome from getting sacked. So when this article of America's not prepared, I will say some of America is not prepared. City people, it's not going to be great for city people. But for folks living out in the country, I think they could very easily become hunter-gatherers. I think fundamental understanding of farming still exists, and I think that we'll be able to bounce back just with a much smaller population if it does come to that. And who knows, maybe we'll build a series of vaults and people can emerge from the vaults and slowly save the wasteland.
I think I read that book once. There is an actual really great fictional. I'm going to have to go back because I can't remember what the title is. I want to say it's called The Silo or something like that. Really, really great, well-written fiction articles about people who live in these big silos for hundreds of years trying to outlast a cataclysm.
There's a series of video games, too, Fallout, which is based off of that premise of people emerging after hundreds of years living in vaults underground to reclaim the earth as the radiation dies down.
Oh, that sounds like a lovely time. So you said something about Japan coming back from a disaster, and I'm going to hand it to the Japanese. They did do a phenomenal job. Having been to Japan and having gone through a natural disaster in the form of a typhoon on the island of Okinawa when I was stationed there as a Marine, what I will tell you is Japanese society, they're very structured, very rule-following, law-abiding society, makes them especially adept to getting over those types of things. So as an example, I went through what's a equivalent of a Category 5 hurricane, which is a typhoon over in the Pacific, when I was on the island. And we're all on lockdown, and, there's a bunch of wind and everything. And I look out my window at one point, and I see this minivan, doing end over end, blowing down through the parking lot. So the winds were so strong, it was blowing cars down the parking lot like they were little toys. So it was not a small storm. I'm going to channel my teenage son here. It was an epic storm. It was pretty awesome. And once that storm had passed, it wasn't like in New Orleans where things were turned off for weeks, months, years. It was about 4-6 hours while the street crews cleaned up the streets, and then it was back to business as usual. Couple reasons for that. One, their infrastructure over in Okinawa is designed because they go through 2-3 typhoons a year, so it's just not a thing. Their infrastructure, their buildings are made out of cement. They're ready for it, just like people in northern states are ready for the blizzards and the snow. They just know it's going to happen. And their society is stratified to the point where everybody has a role. They know what their role is. They know what they're supposed to do. And they don't have the cowboy American culture. Now, I think there's a lot of great things about America. And our quote-unquote cowboy culture in America, rugged individualism in a lot of ways, is great. It lends itself to risk-taking. It lends itself to these incredible inventions. People go out and, they invent Nike shoes. They invent computers. They it's all this part of rugged individualism of the United States of America. I can do it because I'm awesome and I know I can. That also can hinder us in the terms, if you have ever seen a riot, you know how devastating mobs can be. And the problem with rugged individualism in America is we have a tendency to be clannish and to be mobbish. And so in a natural disaster whether a natural disaster or a nuclear holocaust, what have you, I think the big danger, the immediate danger to the American people is just going to be, just that mass chaos, mass hysteria, because our culture, our society is not regimented and not is not as stratified to handle things like that. So I
want to push back. I want to push back on that a little bit.
Push back. Go ahead.
Yeah, because I have an example, and I think you're.
Before you push back, let me finish off this thought. I think Katrina, in terms of natural disasters, I think that is more the rule, especially when cities are concerned, than it is the exception. And I think that's pretty much how Americans handle natural disasters. Wait for it to come, wait for the big the storm, and then we clean up the mess afterwards, and it's a lengthy process. But Thomas, tell me what you think.
Okay, so we have Katrina in New Orleans, and we have Harvey a few years later in Houston. Which of those cities would you say has more of the cowboy culture? You have New Orleans, where a lot of people are wanting to be dependent on the government. That I would say that's more of the culture there. It's not to say it's not also in Houston. But in Houston, people take matters into their own hands. And if their neighbor is stuck in their house, they get out their fishing boat and they put on their cowboy hat and they go and they pluck their neighbor out of their house. And you had hundreds and thousands of people rescued from their homes, not by the government, not from a stratified society, but by normal people taking matters into their own hands and helping out their neighbors. And their identity didn't keep them from doing that. You saw people of all races helping each other. And Houston's one of the most diverse cities in the nation, maybe the most diverse city in the nation. And Houstonians are used to their identity as a Houstonite or Houstonian, their identity as a Texan, and perhaps even their identity as an American superseding their other identities, to the degree that, hey, if somebody's in need of help, I'm going to help you out regardless of the color of your skin or your country of origin. And Houston's kind of a microcosm of the whole planet. There are colonies there from almost every country. You'll find a neighborhood from that country with people speaking that language in Houston. It's a really remarkable city, and yet fully into that cowboy culture. You know, they put their cowboy hats on there. They're independent. They don't like the government telling them what they can and can't do with their land. They have no zoning laws, which I think is just magically amazing. And it's beautiful. And I think that it's a perfect example of how both systems can work. So you have Japan's system definitely works, right? Discipline, order, control. Everyone has a place and every place has a person, and they're able to bounce back. But we're here, we just passed the 1-year anniversary of Harvey, and Houston's bounced back. Sure, there's still some cleanup that needs to happen and still some damage, but people rolled up their sleeves and they cleaned up the mess themselves, and they didn't wait on the government to come and do that for them. And I think that there's a really special beauty in that. And that, I think, is what makes us special as Texans and different as Americans from that kind of more Eastern mindset.
So a couple points there. I don't want listeners to think that, I'm anti-American. Farthest thing from the truth. I think they need to understand my opinions based on what I've witnessed firsthand, being in my international travels and also my experience as a police officer. So yes, people did come together after Harvey. They did some amazing things, newsworthy things that you saw in the news, people going down there with fishing boats, doing incredible Samaritan type of stuff. However, my question, and I really don't know the answer to this question, is that more of the newsworthy, noteworthy exception, or was it the rule? I wasn't there. I don't know the answer to that question. Yes, people can come together, and Americans are amazing about coming together sometimes. And then there's other times where they will absolutely eat each other up, like they did in Katrina and in Ferguson and in other places. So, which way the tide's going to roll, I don't know. And I guarantee you that there's also some negative stories in Houston that we either forgot or didn't hear about or what have you. So I didn't want to get too much into the point of comparing cultures, comparing societies, which one's better, which one's worse, because the rugged individualism, for the sake of public record, I very much believe in. I don't want to be in a stratified society. I don't want government telling me what to do. But just to be intellectually honest, I have to say there's times where that actually comes back to bite us in the butt. And that's just one of the times. And there's times where having a stratified society is beneficial. And in a natural disaster like Japan has, that's one of the times. If I had to choose one or the other, I'll choose our culture any day of the month and twice on Sunday. But
America. Okay, so as we were talking about what countries are prepared for the bomb, there's two countries that I think are better prepared than the United States, and for entirely different reasons. And the first is New Zealand. They have no nuclear weapons. They don't allow American nuclear anything to dock in their ports, and their whole pitch to the world, and they do this kind of quietly, and I'm sorry if I'm kind of blowing their whistle a little bit, but their whole thing is, don't nuke us. We're not going to nuke you. Let us be the time capsule, the rebuilding of the human race. We will continue to exist, and they're an island full of sheep. And if there's one thing that's easier than farming, it's ranching. And so humans were ranching and raising livestock long before we figured out advanced farming techniques. So New Zealand is well situated to survive the fallout. And yeah, it would be difficult if they don't get all of their shipments coming in. But I feel like as long as no bombs landed in New Zealand, they would be the ones repopulating the world with the New Zealanders. The other country is Switzerland. Switzerland knows that they're trying to be neutral like New Zealand, but the problem that Switzerland has is that they're holding all the world's wealth. So there's a huge incentive to take out Switzerland or to go to Switzerland, and they have supposedly built enough nuclear fallout shelters for the entire population of Switzerland, or up to 80% of the population of Switzerland could live in bunkers. Apparently, some of the Alps are hollowed out and have been turned into bunkers that people can live in. And that's their way of surviving. Now, as people emerge from those bunkers, there's still the question of, how do we make food in this new poisoned world? But again, with all of their valleys, I imagine radiation would be focused to whatever valley the bomb went off in, and they would have some valleys that weren't worth nuking, that they could grow their food. So in terms of countries that are prepared for the bomb, if I were putting money, I would put money on Switzerland, and I would put money on New Zealand for using entirely different strategies. America's strategy of, if you nuke us, we will make you cease to exist, is really great until it's not. So our strategy is a little bit different.
So two answers to that, and one is in terms of the poisoned afterworld. If you look at Chernobyl and the area surrounding Chernobyl as a case study, it's really interesting. They've actually done quite a few articles about this. I'll have to go find one of the articles that I read. I think it was in National Geo, about how nature has taken back this area. And scientists go in there and they measure the toxin levels in these animals, and they have extremely elevated toxin levels. Yet still, the wolf packs have come back. And I can't remember what species of deer, antelope they have over there, but the wildlife has come back in a major, major way. I think even bear has come back. So, and they, they took pictures of these animals and they put them in National Geo, and it's not like these animals are freaks where they have 4 eyes and 8 legs or anything like that. It's a regular looking wolf. And I'm sure, they went through, the species went through several, generations of being messed up before they found an evolutionary crease in there where, this specific, line of wolf was able to survive these high cesium levels. So, I think that life is an amazing thing, and that it'll find a way to survive. So that's my point on the long-term view of the poisoned after nuclear world. Going to your point about New Zealand, I think they made a movie about that. Actually, they made a series of movies, and it wasn't New Zealand; it was Australia. It was kind of a dystopia, but Mad Max did survive in the end. So I think we can look to that as a guidebook for the future. And Switzerland has always been prepared to defend itself. It's always been well defended because it's a country surrounded by the Alps. And you're right about it being, the world's piggy bank. So they do have a lot of incentive to not be bombed, and then they are very good at surviving, as they have been for thousands of years. So yeah, I like your point about New Zealand and Switzerland, and I will also put a good word out there for, like I said earlier, any nation that can survive, that can farm, that can ranch without the use of technology. And I'll even go so far to say as North Korea is actually, if it's not the recipient of all of our nuclear hate, if for some outside chance, they didn't get bombed at all for some reason, they're actually in pretty good position to survive because
correction, it's so bad there, bombs wouldn't make it any worse.
And that was kind of my whole point. Everybody's starving anyway. Everybody is a subsistence farmer. It's not like things are going to change a whole lot. So as long as they don't take a direct hit, North Korea, shockingly, could be okay.
Now, I would like to, going back to the bomb, because we've been talking about like the collapse of civilization and what can cause collapses of civilization. I would like to enter an official rant into the annals of official Liberty Buzzard rants. And this is on the term weapon of mass destruction. I hate the word weapon of mass destruction because we've been talking about like, how could the United States survive a nuclear blast, right? Because nuclear bombs, not only do they have this huge heat wave that blows up buildings and they destroy lots of people immediately, but there's also this radioactive fallout that can kill people hundreds of miles away and cause cancer, and it poisons the land so that the land becomes not just unfarmable, but unlivable, sometimes for decades or even for centuries. A nuclear bomb is really, really terrible. And the term weapon of mass destruction includes nuclear bombs, and it also includes chemical bombs and biological weapons. These are not like each other. Biological is even worse, potentially. You create some super virus, you create bubonic plague 2.0, and not only does it destroy the city that you're targeting, but potentially it spreads, through our airport system throughout the whole planet. And we could see the entire population of the planet collapse. That is really destructive. Less destructive to the land, per se. You're not poisoning cities and you're not destroying buildings. There's lots of stuff laying around for the survivors to use and recover from, like we recovered from the bubonic plague. But still really terrible, like really awful. Like we do not want this to happen. We have a huge motivation to make sure that no biological weapon is ever used in any war ever, right? It's just not worth it. Even if you won the battle, it doesn't matter if the disease blows back on your population and half of everybody dies. And then we have chemical weapons, and everyone's like, oh gosh, chemical weapons are a weapon of mass destruction. They must be just as bad as biological weapons and just as bad as nuclear weapons. False. So false. Chemical weapons are more like traditional explosives like dynamite or C4 in how dangerous they are. In fact, sometimes those traditional bombs are more deadly than chemical weapons, which is why you don't see terrorists using chemical weapons. And when you do see terrorists use chemical weapons, sometimes it doesn't make the news. Why? Because they didn't kill anybody. There was this cult in Japan that was intent on using chemical weapons to kill people. And the first time they sent off the bomb, a few people got sick and one or two people died, but no one even realized it was a chemical weapon. And then they did it again, the famous Sarn attack in Japan, I think it was Tokyo. And they killed, I think, 100 people. And it was, I think, the biggest chemical weapon kill in, decades. And very, very terrible. But the result was, if they had used in that same subway a traditional explosive on that train that's moving at super high speed, they potentially could have killed the same number of people. And the problem with chemical weapons is that you have to have a lethal dose, and equilibrium, the force of nature, air, works as hard as possible to dilute chemical weapons quickly so that there is not a lethal dose. You had Saddam Hussein was shelling Israel for days, if not weeks, with chemical weapons. Everyone just put on gas masks and hardly anyone died. The biggest death was like one bomb got through and hit, I think, a barracks of soldiers, and like 100 people died. But again, we're talking hundreds of people and no long-term damage to the land and nothing that spreads from person to person. And when we lump chemical weapons in with nuclear weapons and biological weapons, it causes us to be far more afraid of chemical weapons than we should, which, I don't know, might cause us to invade countries that we are overly afraid of. Because the problem with chemical weapons, you need a lot of that chemical to be worth it. When you see chemical weapons being used effectively, like in World War I, you have artillery as a delivery mechanism because you need a lot of chemical and a little bit of space to keep the air from dispersing it. And if you don't, once you have artillery, like in the ability to shoot artillery, you can shoot traditional bombs that may be just as dangerous. The reason we use chemical weapons is not just because we have conventions saying not to use them, but also because they're not that useful. Once people put on gas masks, suddenly your chemical weapon isn't nearly as effective as a traditional bomb. So anyway, end of rant. But I do think that we are far too afraid of chemical weapons, and we should stop using the term weapon of mass destruction because it lumps unlike things into a category that makes them feel alike.
I think you feel better after that rant, Thomas, but
I want to know your thoughts because you were in Iraq. Like, for me, this is this theoretical thing, but you were actually sitting in bunkers in Iraq as a result of us trying to get rid of chemical weapons in Iraq. So what are your thoughts?
So what I will say is I was a young man in Iraq, early 20s. And what I can tell you, in the decade plus since I have been to Iraq is I've come to realize that our invasion of Iraq, it was a PR coup because in the frame of reference of a weapons of mass destruction, you hit the nail on the head, Thomas. A WMD in this sense that we think of them now, the exotic weapons, the biological weapons, the chemical weapons, they're only more deadly in our minds because they sound scary, because the idea of somebody putting an invisible gas that we can't see out there and everybody strangling to death and choking on their own vomit it's a really scary idea, and it's newsworthy. Dying in a fiery explosion, really, I'm sorry to say, isn't newsworthy. Just as stinking deadly, not as newsworthy. Unless you get a lot of people. So, I mean, if you want to think about it in terms of sheer numbers, a weapon of mass destruction, sheer numbers, I guess you consider a jumbo jet a weapon of mass destruction, depending on its use. There is a point of law in the penal code here in the state of Texas that says an object is considered a weapon depending on the manner of its use. So a baseball bat can be either a fun sporting item or it can be a weapon depending on its manner of use. So, so anything can be a weapon of mass destruction depending on its manner of use. A truck full of nitrate fertilizer, like that was used in Oklahoma City, killed a lot of people. One devastating explosion killed a lot of people. That's a weapon of mass destruction. A nuclear bomb is probably in any sense that it's used, is probably a weapon of mass destruction. A jumbo jet flown into Twin Towers, weapons of mass destruction. So a weapon of mass destruction, purely by definition, is something that with one detonation, you can achieve the same effects as multiple conventional detonations. And I think the idea really comes from Hiroshima and Nagasaki back in 1945, where we were planning, and we had already started the firebombing of the main islands of Japan. They built their houses back at that time of paper, essentially, to devastating effect. The problem is we had to use a lot of planes and a lot of explosives to achieve that carpet firebombing effect, whereas we could have one nuclear weapon to achieve that same effect. So that's really where the weapon of mass destruction, that mental framework comes from. One bomb achieving the same effect as multiple conventional munitions. So, your rant, I think, as far as chemical munitions, biological munitions, being dead one way versus being dead another way, does it really matter? You're both dead at the end. Should we get our panties in a collective wad over a quote-unquote weapons of mass destruction? Not necessarily. What I think we should really be concerned about is the use of any material out there that could be used against us and achieve a great effect. like a jumbo jet or like a truck full of fertilizer. The stuff that we haven't considered, the stuff that we don't know about, the quote unknown unknowns, those are probably scarier to me than any chemical, biological, or any conventional munition out there.
Yeah, what we're afraid of really affects who we are. And I think in general, less fear helps you make more rational decisions. And making decisions out of fear, I think, is always a bad idea.
And that's why the WMDs it was a PR coup, because, and the media played right into it, as they always do, because anything that gets clicks, back then, anything that gets views is going to be played over and over and over again, because that's how they sell advertisements. So you get this sense that, these chemical weapons, these biological weapons are more scary than conventional munitions because the idea of their death is more scary. So the WMD that you were ranting about, it's nothing more than it's just a PR thing.
I mean, when you need hundreds of gallons of the thing to be effective in a small area, no one was asking the question, how... So let's assume Iraq had chemical weapons. No one was asking the question, how are they going to get them here from there? Like, when they were launching chemical weapons into Israel, they were doing it on rockets. But those rockets, they may be able to go a few hundred miles, but they're not going to be able to go, around the planet. That is really complicated. If you're able to send a rocket around the planet, you're able to also send stuff to space. And that's why countries often make a lot of noise about their space programs, because it's a great demonstration of the power and sophistication of their rockets. But even so, if you filled an intercontinental ballistic missile with a chemical weapon, you'd probably be better off filling that same missile with C4, like a traditional explosive, would probably be more effective than filling it with a chemical weapon. At least that's my opinion. We do want to hear what you think. Real quick, before we close, I want to say we have a Facebook page now. We are on Twitter, and we are on YouTube. So you can listen to these videos on YouTube. You can listen to them on Facebook, and you can tweet at us. In fact, I'll say that's where we want to hear what you think. Send a tweet to @LibertyBuzzard. What do you think? Are we totally off base with weapons of mass destruction? Do you think America can survive the bomb? Send us a tweet. We want to hear your thoughts. I'm Thomas Umstattd Jr.
I'm Dustin Hammett.
And you've been listening to Liberty Buzzard. This episode of Liberty Buzzard is brought to you by Tom Umstattd, CPA. Tom has over 35 years of experience helping people like you pay only their fair share in taxes. Don't let the IRS stress you out. Get Tom and his team on your team at taxmantom.com.